Kalam Podcast is made possible through listeners like you. If you enjoy listening to Kalam, please subscribe to the show in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now, and please give us a rating. It helps other people find out about us. And if you'd like to support the show with a small donation, consider signing up to Kalam Podcast on Patreon for just $3 a month. In addition to supporting the show, you'll gain access to lots of great bonus content. Go to patreon.com and search for Kalam Podcast, or go straight to patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. That's patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. Now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Kalam Digest, a weekly news digest where Sam and I speak about some of the most important news happenings this week. So welcome, Sam.
Thank you.
This week we're going to start with a series of attacks on schools in Gaza. This comes as the US has actually delivered $3.5 billion in extra support to Israel. One of the school attacks, and these are obviously schools that are used as refugee centers today. They're not used as schools per se, but there are a lot of civilians that are staying there. In one of these schools attacks, more than 100 people were killed. And Amnesty International confirms that American weapons were used in these attacks. And UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese said on Twitter, "In the largest and most shameful concentration camp of the 21st century, Israel is genociding the Palestinians one neighborhood at a time, one hospital at a time, one school at a time, and one refugee camp at a time." Now, these schools obviously are claimed by Israel to be used as a kind of like military bases by Hamas. Sam, what do you make of this?
Well, you've already given us the gist. I think what's really important to look at here is how this affects international opinion. This is nothing new, of course. Attacks on civilians have been ongoing since 7th of October, similar kinds of bombings. But the fact that the presidential race in the US is heating up and Kamala Harris has been pushed by pro-Palestinian protesters recently to take a stand against Israel makes this, I think, very important development anyway. Despite the fact that it's nothing new in as such. Also the fact that, as you already mentioned, Amnesty has confirmed that American weapons were used and 100 people killed in a school. This the day after $3.5 billion delivered to Israel is, of course, a huge problem for the Democratic Party in the US. Pushes them to take a stand.
Do you think these kind of things, attacks on schools and like refugee centers in Gaza, where American weapons are used, do you think that could like actually affect Kamala Harris's stance? I mean, it might affect her more now before the election, but let's say she wins. Do you think that there is any way that these kind of things could affect her politics moving forward?
I think there's a bigger chance actually of it affecting the politics of the Democratic Party in the long run or the midterm. But coming up to the elections, I think it's very difficult to see them taking a principled stand against Israel because of the huge importance of Zionist money in terms of IPAC, of course, in the election cycle, but also in terms of how vulnerable the left has always been to attacks, critiques of anti-Semitism from the right. It's something that has brought down progressive movements in the past. I think about Jeremy Corbyn, for example, and also is leveled against Mélenchon in France. And we saw when Kamala Harris took over from Biden, the first or second day after that, Trump tried to claim that she was so anti-Semitic or somehow not a friend of Israel, etc., which is obviously not true, looking at her voting record, etc. But so that's something that the Republican Party is clearly aiming to use in the elections, and I think it's a winning card. So I'm pretty certain that Kamala Harris will keep on being as vague as possible in Palestine without endorsing, obviously, these kinds of attacks. But I think there's some kind of hope, I think, with perhaps of a Democratic Party which would win this election, that they might actually put some pressure on Israel. Because as we all know, the opinions around the world of Israel are falling very quickly, including in the U.S. and including amongst Jewish citizens of the U.S.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that it's necessary maybe for us here on Kalam to rain on the liberal honeymoon with Kamala Harris vis-a-vis Palestine, because obviously she's not Genocide Joe, but she is still very much his vice. She was his vice president, and I don't think that her politics differ very much. Okay, so moving on to the next topic, and this is obviously a very speculative topic. We're talking about the imminent attack from Iran, Hezbollah, maybe other groups in Iraq that are Iran-affiliated, maybe even the Houthis in Yemen. This would be an answer to the assassinations in Lebanon, and most importantly, the assassination of the Hezbollah leader in Lebanon. But the most important assassination was of Ismail Haniyeh, the basically political head of Hamas, who was murdered in Tehran. And it's still unclear when this attack will come, what it will look like. The latest kind of intelligence that we've received in the media was from Axios, that reported that new intelligence suggests that Iran is preparing to attack Israel. Now, I think the distinction there is that maybe we thought that because so much time has surpassed, Iran was just maybe giving up on it, or it would do a kind of like coordinated attack. But it seems that according to this new intelligence, if you would believe that Iran has debated it and reached the conclusion that it will attack, and the attack will be more intense than the last one, where it sent a few hundred ballistic missiles, but warned ahead of time. Sam, what do you make of this story?
It's, as you said already, it's very speculative, obviously, but I think it's becoming more and more clear that Iran is planning to respond. They call axis of resistance, as we call themselves, Hezbollah and other groups, including the Houthis, probably, as you said. The big question right now, I think, is how massive will this be? Will it be something that the Israelis can basically contain, as they did with the last one, using the Iron Dome defense system, or will it be something that will actually kill substantial number of Israelis? Which would, of course, shift the balance also in terms of the opinion inside Israel, etc. So far, Israel is, of course, they are in a situation where they see themselves as being under siege, but the number of civilian and even military casualties in Israel is, of course, still far behind the number of dead Palestinians. So if that would shift also the opinion, of course, massively. I think what we can speculate on, there's also been a number of the security leaks from the Israeli security services, Mossad, etc. But it's still kind of vague, but it seems from what they're letting slip, that they think something is going to happen within the next couple of days. So we should probably, that might be a planned leak from them to push some kind of, it's all a very complicated political game, but most probably, since everyone seems to agree that this is what's coming up, that's most probably what's going to happen. But it's still very difficult to see, of course, or to predict the extent and also the methods used. Everyone still seems to think that Hezbollah, for example, has missiles, both kinds of missiles and a number of missiles that would make it possible to break through the Iron Dome, probably, which would, if they use that would be major shift. And also, we know that the U.S. has been speeding up its deployment of the Navy to the Eastern Mediterranean, which, of course, is a sign that they are actually expecting something. They wouldn't do that for propaganda value, probably.
Yeah, I guess if they would do it for propaganda, they would announce it more. But
exactly.
They're doing it a bit quietly. I think we should add that we're recording this around lunchtime on Monday, the 12th of August, and we're probably going to put this out tomorrow morning, the 13th. So if anything happened between now and then, be aware of the date. But yeah, I think that somehow it seems that for 10 months we've been like teetering on the edge of a war, and no one likes to start a war. You know, like you saw what happened when Saddam Hussein tried to start a war. His country was bombed back to some other kind of age, which it still is like languishing in a bit. So I think, do you think I'm assessing it correctly that Iran would love it if Israel like started the war, and Israel would love it if Iran started the war? That there's this kind of game of like blame. There's a blame game going on.
I think you're right to a certain extent. I also think that both sides are actually assessing their capabilities. Of course, no country could actually survive, at least not politically and intact, an all-out war with the U.S. But it's very questionable if the U.S. has either the strength or or prepared to go to war with Iran, for example. And on the other side, of course, Israel. You have Bibi Netanyahu, who is basically doing anything at this point to stay in power because he knows he will be tried and convicted of very serious corruption charges as soon as he loses his immunity. So he has an vested interest in just keeping the war going at whatever cost. But on the other hand, of course, there's an army in Israel which has its own objectives, etc., and which is probably getting stronger in terms of political influence over time as the war progresses. So they don't want to start a war they can't take, basically. And they also need to remember that Iran, both in terms of their history, remembering the Iran-Iraq war, they are very much, I'm not saying they're willing to let many people die, but they are, as a society, I think they are much more open to the idea that this is what happens in a war. While in Israel, even just a couple of hundred of dead civilians in an Iran strike would be devastating to the political.
I mean, it's just it's a matter of just sort of numbers as well. I mean, I think there's like more people living in Tehran than all of Israel.
Yes,
there's that. But I think as well, if Israel, if world opinion interprets an Israeli attack on Iran as like the deranged Netanyahu attacks defenseless Iran, then maybe the U.S., even if they had the strength to back Israel up all the way, they wouldn't. And it might be like a Ukraine situation, which would be very devastating for Israel. But if like Iran bombs Tel Aviv tomorrow and 500 people, 1,000 people are killed, then I think the U.S. would be like 100%, we're behind you, bomb Tehran tomorrow. So I think there's those.
I don't even think you need to do number in the 500,000 people to kill. I mean, it's enough that they managed to get through the Iron Dome and actually kill civilians.
Exactly.
I think that would, So I think on that point you're right. I mean, I think it's very clear that the assassination of Haniyeh was a calculated attempt to get the Iranians to respond somehow. They didn't do that thinking they would get away with it, and they know that since Iran doesn't anymore have the kind of ability to get into Israel, probably they would not be able to do that kind of. They would not be able to respond in kind. Let's say. I mean, they would obviously love it if they could murder Smotrich. That would be, that would be Iran's favorite response. As in 2000 when the PFLP murdered the Kahanist tourist minister, that was very, it was a good look. You kill our leaders, we kill your leaders. But since Iran can't do that, they are counting on Iran to do something much more kind of all-out confrontation.
Well, countdown to Armageddon. On to our next story.
Probably. Sadly,
So, Sam, what's the latest with the negotiations? Obviously, between Hamas, Qatar, Israel, and Egypt and the U.S.
Egypt is involved, and I think Jordan as well. It's kind of vague now who is involved, but I think Qatar and Egypt are the important regional players, of course.
And we're still talking about a ceasefire and hostage deal negotiation, right?
Something like that, yeah. So this is very complicated. It also, of course, connects to the question of a potential Hezbollah-Iran strike, because if that the negotiators have set 15th of August, this Thursday, as the kind of deadline for having a meeting to conclude some kind of agreement. And so they're still waiting, as far as I know. Hamas has said they're not interested in starting another round of negotiations, but they're open to having a ceasefire right away based on the last suggested the proposal that was given before Haniyeh was assassinated. So they're basically saying we can meet up anytime, and we're fine with just finalizing this. Well, Israel hasn't responded yet, and they're trying to frame the fact that Hamas says we don't need any more negotiations. We need to have a deal on the table, as Hamas rejecting negotiations, which is, I don't think they believe that themselves. I think they're trying to just push the blame to the other side, because as far as we can see, Israel hasn't been interested in actually finalizing this deal. And I guess two important points here is, one is the ceasefire is obvious. I mean, an immediate ceasefire, but then what will happen over time? So all hostages held by Hamas will be released. That's clear as part of this deal. But how many Palestinians will be released in exchange? There's at least 7,000, probably much more by now, Palestinian prisoners in Israel, many thousands of whom have not been tried. We've had a number of allegations of rape and serious torture, etc., inside Israeli prisons coming out of the last couple of weeks. So that's obviously something Hamas can't let just drop. They need to get out a significant number of Palestinian prisoners, both in terms of numbers and in terms of profile, political leadership, etc. Of course, I mean, the big price will be if they will get Mustafa Barghouti out, since that is kind of the significant political leader who's in prison, I think.
No.
But so what we can say about the negotiations right now is, will Iran strike before they negotiate a ceasefire?
Yeah.
Is that something that Hamas is counting on, or is it something they're afraid of? I mean, I'm pretty sure that they could get Iran to stand down if they want to. On the other hand, does Israel actually want a war? Is that why they're lagging behind and not agreeing to meet up? So it's very difficult to say, but it's the coming 3-4 days will be decisive. Telling, absolutely. And I know the last important thing to note is that, as far as we can say, Yahya Sinwar, the new leader of Hamas after the murder of Ismail Haniyeh, it doesn't seem that he has signaled some kind of shift in terms of policy or a more radical position or something, which many people obviously have been expecting, since he's known as a hardliner and on the radical wing of Hamas.
All right, Sam, moving on to the last point in this week's digest. On the West Bank, raids and arrests and sort of settler harassment is continuing. In an interview with Time, Benjamin Netanyahu said that East Jerusalem and the West Bank are part of our homeland. We intend to stay there. I mean, this is in line with like all Israeli parties that voted for the overwhelming majority of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that voted to work for there never existing a Palestinian state. Sorry, I said that like an idiot, but you know what I mean.
Just a week ago or something like that. Yeah. 2 weeks. Yeah. Well, exactly, which is very interesting and telling. I think in the West, at least, there's still a strong. A lot of people, especially on the liberal left, who seem to think that there is an Israeli opposition, which would be, as soon as Netanyahu is gone, you would have a more reasonable kind of party to negotiate with. Of course, that might change over time, etc. But if we look at what they're saying and doing at the moment, this is the position of basically the entire Israeli political spectrum. I think perhaps Meretz voted against, which is the radical left-wing Kibbutzim movement, and I think, obviously also the Palestinian parties and the Communist Party, the Jabha, voted against. But that is, in terms of percentage, that's 15% perhaps at most of the votes, and also it's basically Arabs, Palestinians, Palestinian votes. It's a 2-3% perhaps Jewish Israeli population. And yes, Netanyahu saying this, it's nothing new, but the fact that he goes and makes this major interview with Time magazine, and he says this up front, like we're not leaving the West Bank. This is something I would say it wouldn't have happened before 7th of October. Then he would have said one thing in a Time magazine interview, and he would have said this thing. This is what he would have said on Israeli TV in Hebrew. So yeah, it's a very also, apart from all these we talked about before, the major kind of regional developments and the question of a third world war, etc. Just on this kind of very local, very everyday level, there's a lot of repression going on and a lot of conflicts flaring up everywhere, obviously. I think one last thing that I would like to mention is there's been an open letter published by at least 100 major officers in the Israeli army, criticizing the chief of staff, Herzl Halevi.
Okay.
They say we have been astonished by repeated statements from senior army officials that victory is within reach and it is possible to move to the stage of pinpoint raids. These officers say, and they say this is very, very, very far from the truth. We're nowhere close to winning the war in Gaza. We're still obviously killing a lot of people, including surely a lot of Hamas operatives, but they're not anywhere close to actually winning the war and moving into some kind of pacification phase. So this is all interesting. There's a lot of politics going on with this inside Israel, of course, bickering between different both political parties, but also between the army, as said here, and even inside the army. And this is something that will, of course, intensify if they're put under more pressure, for example, in a Iran raid. And it's something that is, I mean, this is the major fear of the Israeli establishment, is that the army will start to fracture along political lines. Because they had this already in the lead up to October 7th, when they had parts of the army saying that they will no longer take orders from Netanyahu, etc., if he pushes through with the juridical reforms. If anyone remembers them still, major part of Israeli internal politics. So I mean, the fact that the fear that the army might actually disintegrate is I think, strong. Not right now, of course, but if they're put under major pressure from Iran, for example.
Okay, well, we'll have to follow these stories as they develop this week. And next week, we might be talking in an entirely different Middle Eastern setting. But for now, thank you, Sam, for today on this very first episode of Kalam Digest.
Thank you, Edgar.